The United States has in the past seen some fiercely disputed elections, but only in a handful of them did the political climate run as intense as the election of 1876, which saw the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, victorious and sworn in as president, whereas Samuel J. Tilden, his rival, had won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College, until he hadn't. At this moment, anger and bitterness of former Civil War enemies was widespread across the United States, and as the nature of this election's outcome became obvious and how quickly they then shifted, many Americans feared that both Hayes and Tilden would simultaneously have themselves inaugurated as president, actions which would then clearly push the country to the edge of another civil war. But how reasonable were these fears? How close was the United States to another civil war in the aftermath of the election of 1876? So, as you know, the American Civil War ended in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy and the fall of slavery as an institution. And after this, the victorious U.S. government had the tough task of reintegrating the defeated states back into the Union. This was done through a process known as Reconstruction, which was neither accepted nor successful. Reconstruction saw the Confederacy split into occupation zones and run by military governors from the Union. All slaves within them were freed, and the federal government gave itself much greater authority and control to act within those states. For a state to leave this status and rejoin the United States properly, they had to approve the 14th Amendment, which gave everyone born within the U.S. American citizenship and granted them all equal rights under the law, at least in theory. In practice, not. Once they had approved the 14th Amendment, these southern states were re-accepted. 5 seconds after this, many of them passed laws which limited the rights of black citizens, heavily suppressed their ability to vote, and also ignored violence against them. You'd think that this would be a breach of their terms of readmission, which would then come with some consequences. But, sad truth, no. The reason that they got away with this was that officially these things weren't done on the basis of race, but instead were based upon things like property, possession, and literacy, which were only very strongly correlated with race, which is technically different. Over the next decade, things only grew more heated, which brings us to the 1876 election. This came at the end of Ulysses Grant's second term as president, who at this point was disliked due to numerous corruption scandals, as well as being viewed as out of touch with the average American. Knowledge of this led to the Republicans nominating the more moderate Rutherford B. Hayes, who sought reconciliation with the South, whereas the Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden, whose being the governor of New York was believed could swing the state away from the Republicans, and his economic plans were well liked in the South, many of whose white residents just wanted the Republicans gone from office and the end of Reconstruction. The election was a narrow one, and because information traveled fairly slowly, each party was mostly working with guesses. The next day, the Democrats declared that Tilden had won the popular vote, as well as all of these states, thereby giving him 203 electoral votes, well over the 185 he required to win. However, the Republicans claimed that in fact, Hayes had actually won all of these states, and the only one which was too near to call was Florida, thereby giving Hayes 181 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, with Florida's 4 votes still in play. It won't shock you to hear that after this things became quite uneasy, because there were some irregularities that happened in these 3 states during the vote. In both Louisiana and Florida, violence and cheating had been a big problem. You see, unlike the modern era, there wasn't any consistency of ballots or methods of voting. And in these 2 states, votes were often placed by posting pre-printed party ballots, and the ballots used by the Democrats had been deliberately made to look like Republican ones, which was thought to have fooled some uneducated voters, i.e. many of them, into voting for the wrong party. Whereas South Carolina had managed the remarkable feat of casting more votes than the listed eligible voters. As such, the still in control were probably not for much longer. Republican-led state governments within these states quickly discarded the votes that they considered invalid, i.e., the ones for the Democrats, and Hayes was soon awarded these 3 states and therefore the presidency. Obviously, this sudden shift was going to cause some bitterness amongst the people, hence why the president-elect was soon given the label rather Fraud B. Hayes by his opponent. Now, normally it would fall to the vice president as head of the Senate to certify the election. But 1, he was too occupied being dead, and 2, the man who had replaced him as head of the Senate was a Republican, and no Democrat would accept his ruling. Furthermore, the Democrats argued that as the party in command of the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, it was up to them to pick the next president, which of course the Republicans were not fine with. Things were looking pretty rough. But guess what though? The 1876 election wasn't finished. You see, Tilden wasn't a fool, and he and his team knew that the Republicans would claim that the federal government had no authority to override the switched results that the state returned for the election. And so the Democrats got the governor of Oregon, an ally of Tilden, to replace one of the Republican Electoral College members with a Democrat, who then voted for Tilden, even though Oregon had swung for Hayes, thereby giving him 1 vote that he needed for triumph. It was at this moment that people started to get really furious, and talk of a civil war began in earnest. The incumbent President Grant ordered thousands of troops to take up positions in and around Washington, D.C. to protect Hayes during the transfer of power. Hayes' swearing-in ceremony was also quietly moved forward by a day and secretly into the White House. And furthermore, Democrats were also barred from the later public ceremony to prevent any possible incidents, whereas on Tilden's behalf, numerous governors offered to call up state militias to fight for Tilden's presidency. And these divides weren't simply across earlier Confederate Union lines either. Union General George B. McClellan was gathering troops in veteran groups and talking to former Confederate leaders in case armed conflict should break out. And some of Tilden's backers also planned to set up their own inauguration in New York to contest Hayes. At this stage, many Americans were now horrified of another civil war and what they called the Mexicanization of American politics, and so fearing another clash, or at the very least mass disobedience, it was decided in the most Washington-like move ever that this crisis would be settled by a commission. Said commission would have 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, 3 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and 2 from the Supreme Court, and it would also include 1 neutral Supreme Court judge who would ultimately be the tiebreaker. And both sides did the unthinkable, and they agreed on something. They agreed that said member would be Justice David Davis because he was viewed as a fundamentally respectable man. But it was here that the Democrats had a clever idea. Let's win him over to our cause by offering to make him a senator. A position which he accepted, but because he was that honorable man, he felt that this would sway his vote, and so he resigned the commission. He was then replaced with another justice, this time a Republican, because all of the remaining justices were, and after a string of partisan votes, Hayes won the election with 185 Electoral College votes to Tilden's 184. Importantly, it had been agreed beforehand that this commission's ruling would be final, unless, of course, both chambers of Congress rejected it, but since only the House did, President Hayes it was, this ruling looked like it could divide the country. But it was here that Tilden accepted defeat, not because he admitted that he lost the election, but because most of his fellow Democrats weren't ready to cross certain lines. He'd also done a terrible job of backing his claim. You see, Tilden was, to use a technical phrase, wealthy, and when his allies asked him to fund their preparations, he refused, and instead stayed quiet and basically waited to see if he would just be made president. Whereas Hayes did not do this, and he was very certain that he had won and was going to be the next president. And anybody who disagreed was anti-democratic, and probably smelled funny too. Tilden only became forceful after the commission had decided for Hayes, at which point it was too late because his supporters had mostly calmed down, at least enough to put the guns aside, because whilst many Democrats and Southerners were angry with the result, they knew that another civil war was too dreadful to imagine. Furthermore, given the slim advantage that Republicans had won by people, and given that many Democrats saw Tilden as a weak nominee, they didn't feel the urge to push too hard because they knew that they'd be guaranteed to win the next one. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Now, there's a widely held belief that says an informal deal was made between the Democrats and the Republicans, known by some as the corrupt bargain of 1877, wherein the Democrats gave Hayes the presidency in return for him ending Reconstruction and withdrawing federal soldiers from the South. Now, he actually did perform these things, but there's zero evidence of such an arrangement ever being made. Now, of course, none of them would have actually written this down. It's just simply the case that Hayes was a much more moderate Republican, and he believed that Grant and his party had been far too severe on the former Confederacy. Also, had this deal existed, then the House of Representatives almost certainly wouldn't have continually refused to acknowledge Hayes's presidency. It even went so far as to pass a bill declaring that Tilden was the actual winner of the 1876 election and that Hayes's presidency was illegitimate. Realistically, of course, this didn't accomplish anything except for make them feel better about the situation, but either way, the election was done, and so, civil war, whilst nearer than many would have imagined, was made more possible due to a lack of process for a disputed election. But it was ultimately avoided by the culture of democracy that the vast majority of Americans and their leaders held dear. Whilst of course people were extremely upset, the vast majority of politicians on both sides acknowledged the horrors of the Civil War could never be repeated, and that for the sake of themselves and the United States, preserving a stable form of government outweighed all else. Calmer heads had prevailed. I hope you liked this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons James Busynet, Sky Chappelle, Kit Kawayan Hockey, Anthony Beckett, Marvin Casau, Winston Quid, Gustav Swan, Captain Sidig, Andy McGee, Alex Schwinn, Coppertone, Robert C. Perkins, Ma Ahmed, AF, Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Castle Bravo, Rod D. Martin, Respectable Level of Chaos Spinning 3 Plates, Arthur Hosey Jr., Ajuan Wong, Shuan, Kamunyun, The Mikwur, Michael Halbert, The Jim Stannon, Kitro, The Flying Deutschland, Starry Nights, Bonnie Bounds, Jim Sternberg, Remco, Heusman, Betkobot, Lord Beak, and Charles I.